The boy should never have been awake at that hour. Yet there he stood, shivering beneath the jaundiced glow of a street lamp on Rue du Cherche Midi, his thin frame swallowed by a coat several sizes too large. He said nothing at first. He simply lifted his eyes toward Inspector Moreau with the weary resignation of someone who had seen something he should not have seen. Paris was quiet in that way. It only became after midnight, when the last café doors had been shuttered and the fog from the Seine crept between the stones like an animal searching for warmth. A distant barge horn drifted through the mist. Somewhere a drunk sang to an indifferent sky. But around the boy there was only stillness, as if the city itself had paused to hear what he would say. Moreau crouched to meet his gaze, the smell of cold iron and extinguished kerosene rising from the street. The boy's lips trembled, not from the cold, but from the burden of words he was afraid to release. And then, barely louder than the fog itself, he whispered something that made Moreau's pulse tighten. It was a name that had no business in the mouth of a child, a name that had haunted the Quai des Orfèvres for months, traced through dead ends, dismissed rumors, and whispers drifting from provincial towns where the newspapers rarely arrived on time. Moreau felt, in that single moment, the weight of a story beginning to take shape. A story that would drag him through the alleys of Paris, the shadowed corners of cafes, and the smoke-filled drawing rooms of people who lived far from scrutiny. But the boy wasn't finished. He looked behind him as though expecting a figure to emerge from the fog. Then he took a step closer to Moreau and confessed one more thing. Something the inspector would spend the rest of the night trying to understand, and the rest of the case trying to believe. If you wish to follow Inspector Moreau through every turn of this shadowed puzzle, as he hunts truth in a city built on secrets, you may support this channel by subscribing, liking, or sharing this investigation. It helps these stories find the people who seek them. The fog had barely shifted when Moreau rose from his crouch, studying the narrow shoulders of the boy who called himself Etienne. The child stood motionless, as though afraid that any movement might summon whatever shadow he believed had followed him. Moreau placed a steadying hand on the boy's back and guided him gently toward the patrol carriage, waiting at the corner. The wheels were slick with dew, and the horse stamped impatiently, sending small puffs of steam into the cold air. Etienne climbed aboard without protest, curling into himself like an animal prepared for flight rather than warmth. Moreau sat beside him, cloak drawn tight, feeling the boy tremble not from cold, but from anticipation of a question he feared would be asked too soon. The ride back toward the Quai des Orfèvres was slow, the damp cobblestones making the horse's hooves clatter unevenly. Paris lay half asleep, windows shuttered, a faint glow from bakeries preparing their first batches drifting into the street like ghosts of warmth. Moreau watched the city pass with the instinctive awareness that something had shifted beneath its surface. The boy's whisper still echoed in his mind, that forbidden name spoken with the reluctance of someone who had rehearsed it in silence for days. He wanted to ask Etienne how he knew it, who had told him, who had driven him into the fog at such an hour. But the boy's profile, lit faintly by a lantern swaying above them, held an expression too fragile to disturb. Moreau would wait. At the quay, the corridors were nearly empty, the echoes of their footsteps amplified by the hardness of the walls. A lone guard nodded at Moreau but made no remark. The inspector's expression made conversation unwelcome. Etienne looked around with wide, uncertain eyes, as though expecting someone to leap from the shadows. Moreau led him into a small interview room, one he preferred for delicate conversations, its single kerosene lamp casting a softer glow than the harsher bulbs used during interrogations. The boy sank into the wooden chair, hands twisting together on his lap. Moreau poured a small cup of hot milk from the pot kept warm by a brass stand. He slid it across the table, watching the boy hesitate before taking it. Etienne lifted it with both hands, his fingers barely steady, and took a small sip that seemed to anchor him to the room. Moreau waited until the boy lowered the cup before speaking, his voice gentle but firm. "Etienne," he began, leaning forward slightly. "You said something on the street, something important. I need to understand how you knew that name." The boy stared at the cup, his reflection distorted by the thin film on its surface. It was long moments before he answered, and when he did, his voice sounded older than his years. "I heard it," he whispered, "in the room above ours. Late at night. They thought I was asleep." "Who were they?" Moreau asked softly. Etienne shook his head. "I don't know their names, only voices. Men. One had a cough, like he was choking on dust. The other spoke, quietly, too quietly. They argued sometimes, not like neighbors, more like people who didn't trust each other." Moreau tapped a fingertip against the table, watching the boy carefully. It was not unusual for children in cramped Parisian apartments to overhear more than they were meant to. Families lived so close that secrets became delicate, fragile things. But the name Etienne had breathed into the fog was not one spoken casually or by chance. It belonged to someone who, according to whispers drifting through the commissariat, preferred the safety of silence. "Did they ever speak to you?" Moreau asked. Etienne shook his head again, more vigorously this time. "They never saw me. I stayed quiet. Maman told me to stay. Quiet, always. She said people notice children too much when they speak." His mouth twisted slightly. "But they notice even more when they listen." There was wisdom in that. Painful wisdom. Moreau felt a tightening in his chest as he watched the boy's fingers grip the cup. Whoever had been in that room above the garret, they had left an impression powerful enough to frighten a child into running through the night. "Where is your mother now?" Moreau asked. The boy's eyes flickered upward, wide and uncertain. "I don't know. She left yesterday morning, said she was going to fetch bread. She didn't come back." He swallowed hard. "She's never left me alone before." Moreau absorbed the words with a heaviness that settled across his shoulders. The disappearance of a mother in a district like Etienne's could mean many things, few of them innocent. He pushed a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to hurry the boy with questions that risked unraveling him. Instead, he leaned back slightly, placing calm between them. "When she didn't return," Moreau murmured, "you went to wait for her." Etienne nodded, eyes dropping again. "At first, but the men upstairs, they were whispering again, talking about the station near Charenton, and they said," his breath hitched, "they said a boy like me sees too much." The words landed with the uncomfortable weight of truth. Moreau glanced briefly at the lamp. The flame wavered, casting shifting patterns across the boy's face. He could almost see the moment Etienne had fled the garret. The fear, the urgency, the trembling knowledge that something had crossed from caution into threat. "Is that why you ran?" Moreau asked. The boy nodded faintly. "I wanted to find someone who would listen. I thought of the police hut near the river, but when I got there, no one was inside. So I walked. I thought maybe I'd find someone who wasn't asleep." A simple, heartbreaking logic. Moreau felt his jaw tighten slightly. The city should not have relied on the instincts of a child to find help in the earliest hours of the morning. He rose and walked around the table, kneeling so his gaze met Etienne's. "You did the right thing," he said quietly, "and you're safe here. No one will harm you." The reassurance felt thin against the enormity of what the boy carried, but Etienne's shoulders eased a little. The lamp hummed faintly, the only sound in the tight room. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened, revealing Janvier, coat still damp from the night air. He stepped inside with the cautious sensitivity of a man accustomed to delicate situations. His eyes flicked to Etienne and then to Moreau, recognizing immediately that something unusual had unfolded. "I've been looking into what you asked," Janvier murmured once the door closed, "and I think you should see this." Moreau rose slowly, motioning for Janvier to wait, outside. He turned back to Etienne. "Stay here. I won't be long. Drink the rest of the milk if you can." The boy nodded without looking up, holding the cup as though it were a small shield against the world. In the hallway, Janvier handed Moreau a folded slip of paper. "This came in a telegram from Chartres last week. I only remembered it because of the name. It mentions seeing a woman and a boy at the station. The woman seemed agitated, according to the station master." Moreau unfolded the paper, reading quickly. His pulse quickened. The dates aligned too perfectly. Etienne had not run from Paris entirely by choice. Something, or someone, had brushed dangerously close to him long before he appeared under that street lamp. "What was she doing there?" Janvier asked in a low voice. Moreau folded the telegram again, slipping it into his coat. "That is what we must find out." Behind him, through the narrow window of the interview room, he saw Etienne staring at the door, small hands wrapped around the warm cup, waiting for someone to tell him that the world had not changed forever. But it had. And Moreau felt, with a sudden, bracing clarity, that the boy's whisper had been less a confession and more a warning, one Paris might not be ready to receive. He stepped back toward the door, drawing a slow breath, preparing to ask the questions that would shape the rest of the night. When Moreau returned to the little room, Etienne had finished the milk and folded his hands on the table, as if awaiting a verdict. The boy's eyes flicked to the inspector's coat, noticing the way one pocket sat slightly heavier than before. Children, Moreau thought, observed everything, especially the things adults meant to conceal. He closed the door quietly behind him, shutting out the murmur of footsteps from the corridor. The lamp flame steadied as he approached, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world consisted of this small circle of light, the boy at its center, and the questions that pressed against the walls unseen. "Etienne," Moreau said, taking his seat again, "I need you to tell me more about the room above yours. Think carefully. When did the men first arrive?" The boy frowned, his brow furrowing as he reached back into memory. "A few weeks ago," he replied. "At least that's when I first heard them. The door above ours used to stay closed. Sometimes an old woman came to sweep the landing and mutter about dust. Then one night, very late, I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy ones. They didn't sound like neighbors." "What made them different?" Moreau asked, letting his tone remain curious, not demanding. "They stopped between steps," Etienne said slowly, "like they were listening, not just walking. People who live there walk straight up because they do it every day. But these feet stopped on the landing outside our door before going up. They waited there a long time." Moreau felt a small chill, as though a draft had touched the back of his neck. "Did they knock on your door?" "No," Etienne whispered. "They just stood there. I could hear them breathing. Then they went up. After that, I heard the door above open and close, and the floorboards creaked all night." Moreau pictured the staircase. Narrow, poorly lit, walls stained with years of smoke and damp. He imagined two men pausing on the landing, listening to the silence behind a thin wooden door where a woman and her child lay awake, pretending to sleep. The image had a weight to it that tugged at something deep in his chest. "Did your mother say anything?" he asked. "She told me to keep my eyes closed and not speak," Etienne replied. "She said there were people who liked to know too much about other people's lives, and that we should never give them reason to notice us." His gaze dimmed. But they noticed anyway. Moreau let the silence stretch for a moment, giving the boy space to breathe. Outside, the first stirrings of morning life were beginning along the Seine. The sounds were faint, filtered through the thick stone, but the inspector could feel them. Carts rattling, the distant call of a hawker, the river itself moving with indifferent persistence. He thought of the telegram in his pocket, of Chartres, of a station master who had watched a woman and a boy move through the world with restless unease. "Etienne," he said at last, "I will go to your building. I will see this room. I need you to show me where you live." The boy's fingers tightened again, a brief, instinctive clench. "Will they be there?" he asked. "The men?" "I don't know," Moreau answered honestly. "But if they are, they will not be the ones asking questions." The hint of steel in his voice seemed to steady the boy. Etienne drew a slow breath and nodded. "I can show you," he murmured. "I know every loose step on the stairs." Within the hour, Moreau and Janvier were in a carriage crossing toward the quarter where Etienne's garret was located. The city had shifted into its morning rhythm, shutters opening like tired eyes, women shaking out blankets above courtyards, the smell of fresh bread and coal mingling in damp air. Etienne sat between them on the narrow bench, small hands folded tightly in his lap. He did not look out the window. He kept his gaze fixed on the inspector's gloved hands, as though the sight of them formed a promise he could trust. They arrived in a street where the buildings leaned forward as if conferring, their facades scarred by age and indifference. Laundry hung like flags of surrender from iron lines, and the air smelled of cabbage, old smoke, and the sour tang of communal stairwells. Etienne climbed down from the carriage with quiet familiarity, leading them toward a doorway recessed into the stone, its frame chipped and darkened by countless hands. "This is it," he said. The stairwell was steep and narrow, walls closing in on either side. A weak light filtered from a window on the first landing, its glass opaque with grime. As they climbed, Moreau counted the steps automatically, noting which boards groaned under their weight. Etienne had been right. Some steps felt worn soft by years of passage. Others held their breath beneath the boot, as if unused to visitors. On the second landing, the boy paused before a door with a dull brass knob. "Here," he murmured. "Our room." Moreau took in the scratched wood, the faint remnants of chalk marks near the frame where a child had once drawn hesitantly, now half erased by time. He placed a hand against the door, then looked down at Etienne. "Is it locked?" The boy chewed his lip. "We don't have a key from the outside," he said. "Maman always locked it from inside with the bolt." Janvier moved forward, produced a set of picks, and worked quietly at the lock. The mechanism yielded with a tired click, and the door opened into a small, dim room that smelled of cold ashes and worn fabric. Morning light slipped through cracks in the shutters, laying pale stripes across the floor. There was a narrow bed pushed against one wall, a wooden crate serving as a table, and a chair with a leg mended by twine. A chipped basin rested on a low shelf beside a folded towel worn thin at the edges. On the crate lay a small comb, a spool of thread, and a pair of scissors. The simplicity of the space spoke of lives lived carefully within narrow means, each object carrying the mark of necessity rather than choice. Etienne stepped inside hesitantly, as though unsure whether he was permitted to cross that threshold without his mother's voice to grant him passage. His eyes moved quickly, taking inventory. "It's the same," he breathed, "but it feels different." "It feels empty," Janvier said softly, staying near the door. Moreau moved slowly through the room, attentive to details. The bed cover was smoothed, but not with the careful precision of someone preparing for sleep. It had the look of haste, of hands that had tried to make things appear ordinary. On a hook behind the door hung a single dress and a worn shawl. Another shawl, the one Etienne remembered his mother wearing most often, was absent. He knelt beside the crate, studying the scissors and thread. "Were these here when you left?" he asked. "Yes," Etienne replied. His voice had shifted, deeper with memory. "Maman sewed late at night sometimes. She said nimble fingers could keep a roof over our heads longer than promises." Moreau lifted the spool, noting that the thread had been cut cleanly rather than snapped. A simple detail, but it suggested a pause in a routine task. Something had interrupted her. He turned toward the window, unlatched the shutter, and pushed it open. The courtyard below sprang into view, a square of stone and dirt where children's chalk drawings mingled with puddles from last night's rain. Threads of washing crisscrossed overhead, and somewhere a radio crackled faintly from a neighboring building, spilling half-heard music into the air. From this window, voices from the surrounding rooms would drift up like smoke, each conversation blending with another until only fragments remained. Moreau listened, imagining how sound traveled in this space. A man's coughing from above, perhaps, interrupted by a muttered curse. The scrape of a chair, a name spoken with care. A boy lying awake, eyes closed, collecting each piece and fitting it together into a half-formed fear. He closed the shutter gently and turned back to Etienne. "You said you hid something beneath your mattress," he said. "Something you didn't want them to find. Do you remember?" The boy hesitated, then moved to the bed. His small hands seized the edge of the thin mattress and lifted. Beneath it, wrapped in a scrap of cloth that had once been part of a dress, lay a folded page torn from a newspaper. Etienne drew it out, fingers trembling only slightly, and handed it to Moreau. "I found it in the stairwell," the boy murmured. "Someone dropped it. I kept it because Maman said it was dangerous to read such things, but I read them anyway. The name was there, the same one they said upstairs." Moreau unfolded the page carefully. It was from a provincial journal. He recognized the typeface, the layout, the kind of paper that arrived in Paris days late, if at all. One column, almost swallowed by advertisements, mentioned a financial scandal in a small town near Chartres. Names were veiled, initials used in place of full identities, but there it was. The same name Etienne had whispered in the fog, a name that should not have been drifting through the halls of a poor Parisian tenement. Janvier leaned in, reading over his shoulder, his brows knitting together. "What's a paper like that doing here?" he muttered. "These buildings barely see yesterday's news, let alone news from the provinces." "That," Moreau said quietly, "is precisely the question." He folded the page again and slipped it into his pocket with the telegram, feeling the weight of coincidence press against his ribs. A woman and her son seen at a station in Chartres. A provincial scandal whispered about in small-town papers. Two men with careful feet and cautious voices, renting the room above a Parisian garret where a boy lay awake, listening. "Etienne," he said, turning back to the child, "when you first heard them say the name, what were they talking about? Try to remember their words." The boy closed his eyes, his lashes casting faint shadows on his cheeks. "They were arguing about papers," he said slowly. "One of them said he didn't come all the way from Chartres to lose everything on a mistake. The other said the city was safer, that people here minded their own business. But then he laughed. He said, 'Except the police at the quay, they like to pull at threads.'" Moreau exchanged a brief glance with Janvier. There it was, laid bare in the recollections of a child, a link between Chartres, the scandal, and men who now walked the stairs above a frightened boy's head. "Did they mention your mother?" Moreau asked. Etienne's eyes opened suddenly, wide and startled. "Not by name," he answered, "but one of them said, 'The woman downstairs has eyes like a ledger. She notices what's missing.'" His voice dropped to a whisper. "After that, Maman stopped going out in the evenings. She kept the door bolted more." The garret felt smaller, the air denser. Moreau was acutely aware of the distance between this cramped space and the airy offices of men whose names appeared only as initials in discrete columns. Somewhere, he knew, someone was counting on the fact that poor tenants and provincial station masters were too insignificant to matter. "Janvier," he said quietly, "I want the names of everyone who rented the room above in the last month. Speak to the concierge, the neighbors, anyone who might have seen them arrive." Janvier nodded, already turning toward the door. "And you?" he asked. "I'll stay," Moreau replied. His gaze moved from the boy to the ceiling above, as if trying to see through the boards. There are shadows in this room that haven't finished speaking. When Janvier left, a hush settled again. Etienne stood near the bed, one hand resting on the frame as if it anchored him. He looked at Moreau with a seriousness that did not belong to his years. "Will you find Maman?" he asked. The question hung between them like smoke. Moreau felt the familiar constraint of honesty. He would not make promises he could not keep. But he stepped closer, lowering his voice, letting each word carry the weight of his intent. "I will follow every step she took," he said. "Every station, every street, until I understand why she didn't come back. That I can promise." The boy studied his face, searching it for doubt. Finding none, he nodded slowly, as if granting the inspector permission to carry his fear on his behalf. Below their feet, life in the building continued. A pot clanging in a neighbor's kitchen, a baby crying in another room, the distant murmur of a radio being tuned. Above them, the room where the men had stayed remained closed for the moment, its silence heavier than any noise. Moreau knew they would have to climb those last steps, not just the physical ones, but the others. The steps that led from a garret in a forgotten street to the polished floors of offices where scandal was a word politely avoided. For now, though, he stood in the narrow room, the shadows lengthening along the walls, the boy's steady gaze on him, and felt the case begin to stretch beyond its immediate edges, like fog reaching for the river. The return to the Quai des Orfèvres felt different this time. Morning had fully settled over Paris, pulling long shadows across the bridges and waking the river into its slow, steady churn. Moreau's carriage moved through the streets at a measured pace, wheels rattling over cobblestones still slick from the night's fog. Etienne sat beside him once again, wrapped in a blanket Janvier had fetched from the station supplies. The boy's small form seemed swallowed by it, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the world with a gaze sharpened by recent fear. Moreau noticed that each time the carriage passed a man lingering on a corner or a figure stepping from a doorway, Etienne's shoulders stiffened slightly. The boy was already learning what it meant to live with invisible threads tugging at every street. When they reached the quay, its imposing facade greeted them like a solemn guardian of truth, too heavy for daylight. Policemen crossed the courtyard, their coats brushing against one another, voices echoing faintly beneath the arches. Moreau stepped down first, offering a hand to Etienne. The boy accepted it without hesitation, though he tried to hide the gesture beneath the folds of the blanket. Together they entered the building, where the air smelled of tobacco, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of ink that never truly left the desks. Inside, the great stairwell spiraled upward, echoing with the footsteps of clerks and officers moving between floors. Moreau led the boy toward Janvier's office, a modest room cluttered with files, maps, and the scent of burnt coffee. Etienne perched on a chair near the window, looking out at the river below. The Seine flowed with its usual patient indifference, unaware or uncaring of the small dramas unfolding within the walls above it. Janvier arrived moments later, breath visible from the cold of the morning fields he had crossed in the carriage's wake. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, catching his breath. "The concierge gave us 2 names, he said, pulling a folded note from his coat. "Neither seems to appear in our records. That alone is curious." Moreau took the note, reading the names silently. Monsieur Dupré and Henri Roussel. Both too ordinary, too clean, like stones smoothed by a river, hoping to disguise their origins. "Did she remember their faces?" Moreau asked. "Only that one was tall, the other short," Janvier replied. "They paid in cash, came and went at odd hours, and they asked too many questions about who lived below them." Moreau's gaze shifted to Etienne, who seemed to shrink slightly at the confirmation. The inspector felt a tightening in his chest. A little boy being discussed in such terms, as though he were a detail on a ledger page instead of a living child. "We'll need sketches," Moreau murmured. "And to speak to the neighbors again." Janvier nodded. Lucas is on it. Moreau turned back to the desk, the telegram still tucked into his pocket. There was something in the simplicity of the names that troubled him. Men involved in provincial scandals did not usually come to Paris to hide, unless they believed the city would swallow them whole, unless they trusted that its endless staircases and crowded quarters offered anonymity that the countryside could not. He reached for a file on his desk, a case long dormant, yet strangely familiar. Charts of financial irregularities, letters scrawled in agitation, reports from provincial officers whose updates ceased abruptly. The missing pieces of a puzzle that had once intrigued him, but which the commissariat had instructed him to drop, due to lack of actionable evidence. But the evidence had not been lacking. It had been tangled in the roots of powerful men who could afford to make questions disappear. Janvier took a seat across from him, lowering his voice. Lucas said something strange, Moreau. The commissaire asked this morning if anyone had reopened the Chartres file. He didn't sound pleased at the possibility. Moreau felt the words settle like a weight. Did he say why? No, Janvier said, only that it was better left alone. A delicate tension moved through the room, tightening the air. Etienne sensed it too. His gaze shifted from the window to the two officers, his small hands tightening around the blanket. Moreau forced his expression into calm, though inside a storm had begun to take shape. He rose, walking toward the tall wooden cabinet that housed older case files. He opened its heavy doors with effort, scanning the rows of folders. Some were thick with paper, others thin and neglected. He found the file marked with the initials CM, the same that appeared in the provincial article hidden beneath Etienne's mattress. He pulled it out, dust lifting in a small cloud that caught the light. He laid the file on the desk, unfolding its contents slowly, as though expecting the pages to speak. Letters between an accountant and a provincial mayor. A missing sum of money too large to be dismissed as human error. Witness statements that contradicted each other. A page torn from a ledger. A telegram requesting clarification that had never received a response. And then, at the very bottom, a note in a handwriting Moreau recognized all too well. The commissaire's own. Do not pursue further, a matter resolved at a local level. Resolved. A word that meant everything and nothing. Janvier leaned closer. You think this ties to the boy? I think, Moreau said, his voice low, that someone wanted this file buried, and then two strangers arrived in Paris carrying shadows from the very town where this scandal began. He closed the folder gently, but his hand lingered on the cover as though feeling for a heartbeat beneath it. We'll need to bring this to Lucas, Janvier said. Moreau shook his head. Not yet. Not until we understand who else is watching this case. Someone has eyes on it already. He looked at Etienne again. The boy had risen from his chair and was standing beside the window, staring down at the river. His reflection in the glass looked older than his years, softened by the blur of condensation. He turned as Moreau approached, and the inspector saw something new in the boy's eyes. Exhaustion, yes, but also a flicker of trust. A dangerous thing because trust created responsibility heavier than any file. Etienne, Moreau said gently, I want you to stay here for now, just for a while. Janvier will bring you something to eat. The boy nodded, though the tension in his posture suggested he felt safer near Moreau than anywhere else. But there were steps the inspector had to take alone. He retrieved his coat from the stand near the door. Janvier, keep him in your office. Don't let anyone else speak to him unless I return. Janvier nodded sharply. As Moreau stepped into the corridor, the atmosphere of the quay shifted around him. Officers walked past with hurried purpose, clerks clutching stacks of papers. The murmur of conversations carried through the air like fragments of storms. But beneath the routine hum, he sensed something else. A subtle wariness, as though the walls themselves were aware that a thread had been tugged too hard. He headed toward the archivist's room, a place where old papers were catalogued with meticulous care by a man named Vaudreuil, whose face always seemed dipped in shadows. Vaudreuil looked up as Moreau entered, eyes sharp behind round spectacles. "You're early," he remarked. "Looking for something?" "A list of financial cases forwarded from Chartres 2 months ago," Moreau said. Vaudreuil lifted a brow. "Those were marked confidential." He paused, leaning back. "And they were not sealed with your department's stamp," meaning someone outside the investigative divisions had intervened. Someone with reach. Moreau's pulse slowed, each beat deliberate. "Can I see them?" he asked. The archivist hesitated. "If I say yes, I risk trouble. But if I say no, you'll think I'm part of the trouble." Their eyes met for a long moment. Finally, Vaudreuil exhaled. 5 minutes, he said. No more. He disappeared behind the rows of cabinets, leaving Moreau with the faint ticking of a distant clock. When he returned, he carried a thin stack of folders tied with twine. He set them on the table, fingers lingering as if reluctant to release them. Moreau untied the twine, scanning the pages quickly. Names he recognized. Others he didn't. Discrepancies circled in red pencil, and there, near the bottom, a note referencing a woman who had insisted on speaking out, initials matching those of Etienne's mother. His breath caught. She had tried to expose something, and then she vanished. He closed the file slowly, feeling the weight of the truth settle like a stone in deep water. When he returned to Janvier's office, Etienne sat at the desk, eating a slice of bread and butter with small, careful bites. Janvier stood near the window, watching the courtyard below. Moreau entered quietly. "We need to move quickly," he said. Janvier straightened. "What did you find?" "Enough," Moreau replied. His gaze fell to the boy. "More than enough." Etienne looked up, crumbs clinging to his small fingers. "Are we going back to my home?" he asked. "No," Moreau said softly. "We're going somewhere safer. For you, and for the truth." The boy nodded, though worry fluttered across his face like a small bird trapped behind glass. Moreau rested a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you won't face it alone." He meant it. And as the bells of Ile de la Cité tolled the hour, deep and resonant, the investigation that began with a whisper thickened into something far more perilous. A case stretching from narrow Parisian stairwells to provincial scandals, from dusty archives to the halls of men who believed themselves untouchable. Moreau felt the tension coil within him. The threads were coming together, and someone, somewhere in Paris, had just realized that one of them had snapped. Moreau did not take Etienne to one of the impersonal institutions the city occasionally used for children caught in the eddies of investigations. He knew those places too well, sour-smelling corridors, beds lined like arguments no one wanted to hear, overseers whose patience ran thin by nightfall. Instead, he brought the boy to his own building on a quieter street not far from the Jardin du Luxembourg, where the chestnut trees, even in their bareness, seemed to offer a kind of watchful calm. The stairway there was broader than the one in Etienne's tenement, the air less thick with cooking smells and despair. As they climbed, the boy tucked his hand into Moreau's without being asked, the gesture simple and unpretending. Madame Moreau opened the door before he had finished turning the key, her apron still dusted with flour. She had the sort of face that did not startle easily, lines of worry softened by years of accepting whatever the world carried to her threshold. For an instant, her eyes narrowed with question at the sight of the boy, then moved to her husband's face, reading in it the things he had not yet said. "This is Etienne," Moreau said quietly. "He will stay with us for a little while." Madame Moreau stepped aside, allowing them in. "Come," she said to the boy, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact, as if such arrivals were ordinary. "You must be hungry. There's soup on the stove." In the small warmth of the kitchen, Etienne sat at the table, his feet barely touching the floor. He watched as she ladled thick vegetable soup into a bowl, the steam rising in soft spirals. A slice of bread, crust still crisp, joined it. He murmured a thank you barely audible, then began to eat with the restrained haste of someone who had learned never to show too much need. Madame Moreau did not press him with questions. She asked only whether he preferred more bread, if the soup was too hot, whether he would like a blanket later. Her quiet diligence circled him like an invisible shawl. Moreau stood near the doorway, observing the scene, feeling something tighten and ease inside him at once. Bringing the case into his home was a risk, he knew. Not just for the investigation, which depended on discretion, but for them all. Yet leaving the boy anywhere else seemed unthinkable. When Etienne's bowl was empty, Madame Moreau wiped his mouth gently with a cloth, then led him to the small spare room that had once belonged to their son before marriage, and work drew him to another quarter of the city. The bed was narrow but clean, the coverlet neatly folded. Etienne brushed his fingers across it as though testing whether it would vanish at his touch. "You may rest here," she said. "No one will disturb you. And if you have bad dreams, you can knock on the wall. I sleep just beyond it." He nodded, eyes suddenly glossy with a tiredness far deeper than physical fatigue. "Thank you, madame," he whispered. She closed the door softly behind her. When she turned back to her husband, her expression lost its gentle neutrality. "What have you brought into this house?" she asked in a low tone. "A boy who knows too much," he answered, lips tightening faintly. "And shadows that belong in our files but have slipped out into the streets." Her gaze held his for a long moment. "You'll keep him safe?" "I'll try," he said. It was the closest thing to a promise he could give. By the time Moreau left the apartment, the light outside had shifted into that uncertain hour when day and evening examine each other through half-closed lids. He walked back toward the river, the air cooling, the smell of damp stone rising from the pavements. The city had put on its coat of noise again, wheels clattering, voices crossing paths, the chime of a tram bell in the distance. All of it seemed heightened, as if each sound threaded back to the same concealed origin. Janvier was waiting for him near the entrance to the quay. "Lucas thinks he has something," he said, falling into step beside Moreau. "He spoke to a fruit seller who works near your boy's building, said he saw the two men from the garret more than once. They like to end their evenings at a café on Rue des Lombards." "A café," Moreau repeated. "Name. The proprietor calls it Le Repos des Marchands," Janvier replied. "Modest place, but the sort where voices carry when the wine loosens them." Rue des Lombards. The name stirred an old familiarity. Streets lined with shop fronts, narrow facades pressed close, the aroma of roasting meat and cheap wine spilling into the air. A café there could be many things. A refuge, a stage, a hunting ground. It would depend on who occupied its corners. "Have you been there?" Moreau asked. Janvier shook his head. "I thought you'd want to hear it first." Moreau nodded once. "Then we'll go now. If they frequented the place, someone will have noticed more than they intended." The walk to Rue des Lombards took them across the river and through streets where shopkeepers were drawing shutters halfway down, preparing for the evening trade. The sky had turned the color of tarnished silver, clouds bruised near the horizon. Moreau pushed his hands into his coat pockets against the chill, his mind moving ahead toward the café, rehearsing questions not yet asked. He thought of the boy in his spare room, of Madame Moreau laying out a second blanket, listening for unfamiliar sounds in the hallway. The case had ceased to be an abstraction the moment Etienne whispered that name into the fog. Now it lay across him like a second coat. They found Le Repos des Marchands, nestled between a shop that sold cheap linens and a narrow doorway leading to yet another stairwell. Its windows were fogged from inside, the glass streaked by years of smoke and unpolished hands. A faded sign above the door displayed its name in flaking letters. From within, Moreau heard the low murmur of voices, mingled with the clink of glasses and the faint, mournful stretch of an accordion playing somewhere near the back. He pushed open the door. Warmth and smoke greeted him in a single wave. The room was crowded but not oppressive, tables packed close, chairs worn smooth by countless evenings. Men in work coats hunched over their drinks, their faces lined with fatigue, while a couple of clerks in frayed suits argued quietly over a newspaper laid open between them. A waitress moved between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing plates and baskets of bread. Moreau stood a moment in the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Conversations faltered briefly as patrons glanced toward the newcomer, instinctively evaluating him, his presence, the cut of his coat, the set of his shoulders. None of it quite matched the habitual clientele. Recognition flickered in a few pairs of eyes. Not of the man, perhaps, but of the profession. The police had a way of announcing themselves without needing words. He made his way to the counter where the proprietor, a thick-set man with a mustache like a graying broom, polished a glass with a cloth that had seen better days. The man's gaze traveled from Moreau's face to his shoes and back again. "What can I get you, monsieur?" he asked in a tone carefully neutral. "A glass of red," Moreau said, placing a few coins on the counter, "and a corner table if you don't mind. Somewhere I can watch the door." The proprietor's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That depends on whether you're here to drink or to listen." "Both," Moreau replied, "and to ask a question or two." The man poured the wine, set the glass on the counter, then leaned in slightly. "Questions are more expensive than wine." "Then it's fortunate," Moreau said quietly, "that I'm paying with more than coins." He slid one of his calling cards across the wood. The proprietor glanced down, saw the title printed beneath the name, and his attitude shifted in a subtle exhale. "Inspector," he murmured. "Then perhaps a table near the back would suit you. People talk more when they think you're not listening." He led Moreau and Janvier to a corner where the light from the hanging lamp was softer, shadows thickening around the edges. From there, the inspector could see the door, the bar, and most of the tables. The accordion player, a thin man with a tired mustache, sat near the far wall, fingers moving across the keys with automatic melancholy. Once they were seated, glasses before them, the proprietor lingered. "You said questions," he remarked. "I assume they're not about the quality of my wine." "I've tasted worse," Moreau replied, in places where the clientele was less careful about what they said after the third glass. The man huffed. "My clientele talks too much, if you ask me. About politics, about prices, about women who don't belong to them." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And lately, about things that make people nervous when a man like you walks in." "Two men," Moreau said, his voice low. "One tall, one shorter. They came from the direction of a certain tenement more than once. Paid with cash. Perhaps they preferred your wine." The proprietor's gaze flickered toward a table near the middle of the room where no one sat at the moment, two chairs pulled out as if waiting for occupants who had not yet arrived. "They liked that table," he said. "Backs to the wall, eyes on the door. Came in 3-4 times a week for a while. Then suddenly, nothing." "Did they give names?" Janvier asked. "Not to me," the proprietor answered, "but sometimes to the waitress. Men like that don't know how to sit in silence. They talk to feel their own importance." Moreau watched a line of smoke rise from a nearby table, twisting in slow coils that blurred the faces behind it. The cafe hummed around them, a world within a world. The smell of garlic and frying onions mingled with wine and sweat and the faint sweetness of spilled liqueur. "What did you hear?" Moreau asked, even if it sounded like nothing at the time. The man hesitated, then wiped his hands on his apron. "Once they were arguing," he said. "The taller one had a temper. He said something about the boy. that it would be easy enough to make him disappear, that children in Paris vanished every day and no one cared. The other told him to keep his voice down. He said, as long as he doesn't talk to the ones at the quay, we have nothing to fear. His gaze met Moreau's. I made a point of remembering that. A silence settled between them, heavy as wet cloth. And you did not think to mention it before? Janvier asked, not accusing, but with a tension that edged his words. The proprietor's jaw tightened. Inspector, do you know how many men come through here talking bigger than their lives? If I wrote down every threat muttered over cheap wine, you'd need a room twice the size of your archive to store them. It's only when someone like you arrives, asking about those specific men, that the pieces begin to fit together. It was a fair answer. Moreau nodded slowly. Did they meet anyone else here? He asked. Anyone who arrived separately and left soon after them? The proprietor frowned, thinking, yes. A man in a better suit. Not rich, but careful with his clothes. He wore a hat pulled low, like he didn't want his face remembered. When he came, the two stood up at once, like pupils before a schoolmaster. They talked only a little, in low voices. But afterward, the taller one always drank more. And this man, did he leave a name? Moreau pressed. Only once, the proprietor said. He left a calling card on the table when he paid. Perhaps by accident, perhaps not. I found it after they left. It had only initials, but the paper was good. Do you still have it? Janvier asked quickly. The man hesitated. Then he nodded toward the back. I keep such things. Call it habit or superstition. He straightened. Wait here. As the proprietor walked away, Moreau's gaze drifted across the room. At a table near the door, a man folded his newspaper too quickly, eyes darting toward the inspector's before shifting toward the window. The accordion player's tune faltered briefly, then resumed. Somewhere a glass broke, prompting a burst of laughter that sounded louder than it needed to be. Someone is nervous, Janvier murmured under his breath. Good, Moreau replied. Nervousness speaks in ways words do not. The proprietor returned with a small tin box, dented at one corner. He opened it on the table, revealing a jumble of old receipts, scraps of paper, and 2 or 3 faded tickets from music halls. From somewhere near the bottom, he drew out a stiff rectangle and handed it to Moreau. The card was simple, cream-colored, the edges only slightly frayed. On it, in clean black letters, were printed 2 initials and a surname that made something twist in Moreau's chest. The name did not belong to the poor quarters, or even to the modest cafe trade. It belonged to offices with high windows and carpets thick enough to muffle inconvenient footsteps. It belonged to someone who, according to certain internal whispers at the quay, had once interfered with an investigation by calling it needlessly disruptive. Moreau turned the card between his fingers, feeling its weight. Does he ever come here alone? He asked. Not since those 2 stopped coming, the proprietor replied. Perhaps he found another place where the wine is less talkative. Moreau slipped the card into his pocket, alongside the folded newspaper page and the telegram from Chartres. Together they formed a quiet chorus, none of them loud enough alone, yet unmistakable when heard together. As he and Janvier rose to leave, the accordion's melody changed, sliding into a tune with a hint of unease. A man near the door met Moreau's gaze for a fraction of a second before looking away, fingers tightening around his glass. The inspector noted him, filed him away, but did not approach. Not yet. Outside, the air felt sharper, the street lights beginning to glow with yellow halos against the encroaching dusk. The noise of the cafe muffled behind them, replaced by the softer rush of evening traffic and the distant toll of bells. Janvier blew out a breath that plumed white in the air. So the scandal has a face now, he said, or at least a name on good paper. Yes, Moreau replied, and that face has been looking in our direction for longer than we knew. They began to walk back toward the river, their footsteps falling in rhythm. Above them, windows lit up one by one, small squares of brightness in the darkening facades. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle carried faintly on the wind, a reminder that Chartres was not so far away after all. In a modest apartment near the Jardin du Luxembourg, a boy lay on a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a safe home. In a café on Rue des Lombards, the proprietor locked away his box of forgotten slips and cards, wondering what storms they might yet summon. And at the Quai des Orfèvres, papers waited in drawers, their ink dry but their stories far from finished. Moreau felt the city closing in, not like a trap, but like a tightening knot holding threads together until someone dared to cut them. He intended to be the one holding the knife. The decision to leave Paris that evening settled over Moreau with a sense of inevitability, like a tide he could no longer hold back with questions or paperwork. The name on the proprietor's calling card, the torn newspaper in Etienne's garret, the telegram from the station master. All of them pointed toward Chartres with a certainty that left no room for hesitation. Yet it was not the clues themselves that pushed him toward the provincial town, but the image of the boy lying in the spare bed of his apartment, one arm curled beneath his cheek as though he expected the night to wake him with whispers. Etienne slept lightly, ears tuned to danger. His dreams, whatever they were, had no childlike innocence left in them. Moreau knew that some part of the truth lay waiting beyond the city, in a place where the tracks glistened under the moon and the quiet had a way of amplifying guilt. He returned home briefly to check on the boy before departing. The hallway outside the spare room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of the lamp that Madame Moreau insisted on leaving lit. When he pushed the door open a fraction, he found Etienne awake, eyes glinting in the half-light. The blanket was drawn up to his chin, but his expression carried a knowing resignation. "You're going somewhere," the boy whispered. Moreau stepped inside, lowering his voice. "For a night. I need to speak to someone outside the city, someone who may have seen your mother." Etienne swallowed, his throat moving slowly. "Will you come back?" "Yes," Moreau said firmly. "Before dawn if I can." He hesitated, then added, "And no one will know you're here except Janvier and my wife. You're safe." The boy's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the blanket. Not trusting himself to say more, Moreau placed a hand gently on the child's head, then withdrew as quietly as he had entered. Safety, he thought as he stepped back into the corridor, was a fragile word, especially when spoken in a city where shadows traveled faster than truth. The Gare d'Austerlitz was quieter at night, though still filled with the restless hum of travelers whose lives depended on the timetables pinned above the ticket counters. The air smelled faintly of coal and damp wool, with a lingering undertone of newspaper ink. Lanterns cast trembling halos across the platforms, reflecting off puddles that mirrored the hunger for movement. Moreau bought his ticket with the ease of a man accustomed to sudden departures, then made his way toward the platform where the Chartres train waited like a patient animal, steam hissing softly from its underbelly. The compartment he chose was nearly empty. A thin, balding man in a worn coat slept with his head against the window, breath fogging the glass. Across the aisle, a woman clutched a basket filled with laundry, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Neither posed a threat, nor did they seem likely to overhear anything of importance. Moreau set his hat on his lap and watched as the train lurched into motion, pulling free of the city with a long, low whistle that seemed to slice the night open. Paris receded behind him, its lights flickering like embers sinking into darkness. Beyond the city limits, the countryside stretched wide and solemn beneath the moon. Fields lay bare, their contours softened by frost, hedgerows appearing as thin brush strokes against the pale landscape. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails filled the compartment, a sound both soothing and relentless. It left Moreau alone with his thoughts. a state he did not particularly welcome. The calling card in his pocket felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Those initials, that surname. They represented a man who had appeared in Moreau's world only in rumors. Rumors of quiet interventions, of cases closed prematurely, of witnesses persuaded to forget what they had once recounted with certainty. A man who dined at tables where decisions were made before the investigation even began. A man who, if connected to the scandal in Chartres, might be powerful enough to erase the breadcrumbs leading back to him. But he had not anticipated a child, or a mother who listened too closely. The train rocked gently, and Moreau allowed his eyes to follow the blurred shapes outside the window. A lone farmhouse with one light burning, a row of trees bending under the weight of the wind, the skeletal outline of a shuttered station long abandoned. He wondered where Etienne's mother had been standing when the station master noticed her, whether she had carried fear openly or concealed it beneath a layer of determination. Women, he knew, often learned early how to hide their desperation behind daily necessities. A bread purchase, a question asked casually, a coin passed with trembling fingers. When the train slowed as it approached Chartres, Moreau stood and stretched slightly, the stiffness in his shoulders reminding him that tension could be as enduring as memory. He stepped onto the platform, boots crunching against scattered gravel. The air here was colder than in Paris, threaded with the metallic tang of farmlands sleeping under frost. Lanterns flickered along the station wall, their flames bending with the wind. Only a handful of passengers disembarked, their bodies hunched inside overcoats. The station master, a thin man with graying hair and a mustache that looked combed with meticulous care, stood near the ticket booth, stamping a stack of papers with repetitive precision. Moreau approached him, waiting until the man glanced up. Recognition flickered, not of Moreau himself, but of his profession. Policemen carried an unmistakable gravity in their speech and bearing. "Good evening," Moreau said, presenting his identification. "Inspector Moreau, Quai des Orfèvres." The station master's brows lifted. "Paris police," he said slowly. "We don't often see your kind here at this hour." "I'm looking for information," Moreau replied, "about a woman and a boy who passed through the station recently." The man's expression shifted subtly. Not quite surprise, but something bordering on unease. "Ah," he murmured. "Yes, I remember them." He gestured toward a narrow bench beside the wall. They sat. The station master removed his cap and rubbed his hands together as though dredging warmth from memory. "She came through early," he began. 2 weeks ago, perhaps a bit more. The fog was thick that morning. Trains ran late. She looked tired, not in the usual way travelers do, but as if the night had followed her. "Was the boy with her?" Moreau asked. "Yes." He clung to her skirt. The man paused, eyes narrowing in recollection. "She kept looking over her shoulder, and she didn't buy a ticket immediately. She watched the doors more than the timetables." "What train did she take?" Moreau pressed. "She didn't." His voice dropped. "She disappeared." Moreau frowned. "Disappeared?" The station master nodded. "She asked about departures to Paris, but before she purchased anything, she walked toward the end of the platform. I turned away for a moment to stamp papers. When I looked back, she was gone. Only the boy remained." A cold breath slipped into Moreau's lungs. "Etienne?" "Yes," the man said. He stood near one of the pillars, as though waiting. When I realized the woman was no longer with him, I approached, but before I reached him, a man, well-dressed, hat pulled low, stepped in. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "His mother asked me to watch him." Moreau's jaw tightened. "And you believed him?" "At the time, yes." The station master's voice cracked slightly. He seemed sure of himself, confident. The boy didn't protest, but when the man turned, I caught a glimpse of something in the boy's eyes. Not fear. Confusion. What happened next? Moreau asked. They walked toward the exit together. When I finished my work, I tried to find them, perhaps to reassure myself that all was well. But they were nowhere on the street. Gone. Like smoke. The train behind them released a sigh of steam, as though confirming the station master's story. Moreau stared at the gravel for a moment, fitting each piece of the account into the growing constellation of evidence. A provincial scandal. 2 men in a Paris garret. A calling card belonging to someone far above modest cafes. A woman who vanished between breaths. A man who took a boy by the shoulder and led him into uncertainty. "Did the man speak to you?" Moreau asked quietly. "Only to say that the boy was in safe hands," the station master replied. "But his voice, I remember it. Calm. Too calm. As if rehearsed." Moreau rose slowly. "You've been very helpful. If you remember anything more, anything at all, send word to the quai." The station master nodded, though worry flickered in his eyes. "Do you think the child is in danger?" "He was," Moreau answered, "but not anymore." He stepped back onto the platform, letting the cold wind scrape across his cheeks. Somewhere in Paris, Etienne slept under a roof free of footsteps overhead. But the man who took the boy's mother had not vanished, and neither had the men who whispered above the garret. As he boarded the returning train, Moreau felt the investigation crystallize into a single, undeniable truth. Whatever had begun in Chartres had carried its weight to Paris, not by accident, but by design. And the boy, small, quiet, shivering beneath a street lamp, might be the thread someone feared most. The train whistle sounded. Moreau settled into his seat, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The train slid back toward Paris, as if reluctant to return him to the city's tangled streets. Moreau sat with his coat buttoned to the throat, hat tilted low, eyes half closed against the rhythmic shudder of the carriage. Outside, the countryside retreated into darkness, the occasional farmhouse light burning like a solitary confession. In the distance, he replayed the station master's account in his mind, turning it over the way some men turned a coin, feeling its worn edges, searching for the detail that might catch. A woman vanished at the edge of a provincial platform, a well-dressed man stepping in with rehearsed assurance. A boy led away, not with force, but with the quiet inevitability of an arrangement made long before he understood his part in it. In another compartment, someone cleared their throat and the sound rippled faintly through the thin wall. The air smelled of coal and old upholstery. Moreau reached into his coat and drew out the folded newspaper scrap taken from beneath Etienne's mattress. Its edges had softened from handling, the ink slightly smudged. The column that mentioned the scandal in Chartres was small, almost timid, crowded by advertisements for patent remedies and announcements of livestock auctions. Yet the tone of the piece was not timid at all. It carried a controlled indignation, the kind of careful outrage that dared to hint without naming, that outlined shapes and invited the reader to supply the faces. It was not the scandal itself that held him now. It was the way certain letters of the initialed name seemed to align with the surname on the calling card from the café. Once seen, the connection was difficult to unsee. An absent ledger, a town's missing funds, a woman who insisted on speaking out, according to the archival note, and a boy who listened through thin boards while grown men argued above his head. The story was trying to write itself, but too many hands had already crossed out sentences, torn pages, and shoved them into drawers. When the train eased into the outskirts of Paris and finally pulled into the station, the sky above the city was just beginning to pale at the edges. Dawn had not fully arrived, but the night was loosening its grip. Moreau stepped onto the platform, fatigue settling into his bones with the familiar weight of long hours, and made his way out into the chilled air. The streets were quieter than they would be an hour later, and his footsteps echoed hollowly on the stone. He did not go home. The thought of seeing Etienne before he had more answers felt like a betrayal of the boy's tentative trust. Instead, he turned toward a part of the city where the air never fully slept. The streets near the newspaper offices. There, even when the rest of Paris drowsed, compositors and editors leaned over proofs, ink stained their fingers, and stories were decided upon in rooms too warm and too small for the importance they claimed. The building housing one of the more reputable dailies loomed with its facade already streaked by years of smoke and rain. He climbed the stairs inside, the smell of ink and hot metal rising to meet him. On the second floor, a harried clerk with a crooked collar looked up as Moreau entered. The man's eyes flicked immediately to the badge, and his shoulders stiffened. "Inspector," he ventured. "Is there some problem?" "Not yet," Moreau said. "And with luck, none that will require mentioning your name in any report." He laid the scrap of provincial paper on the counter between them. "I need to know where this came from. The journal it belongs to. Who writes for it? Who owns it?" The clerk glanced at the scrap, then toward the door behind him as though gauging how much trouble might be summoned by cooperation. "That's not one of ours," he muttered. "Provincial, but we receive exchanges." He disappeared into a side room and emerged with a bundled stack of newspapers tied together with twine. He flipped expertly through the collection, fingers stained black as he scanned mastheads. Finally, he slapped one down on the counter. "There, that's your journal." The masthead was modest, the kind used by small-town weeklies trying to look larger than they were. Moreau traced the name with his eyes, noting the town's location in a margin of the département, where Chartres exerted quiet influence. At the bottom of the page, in small letters, was the name of the editor. It meant nothing to him. But a note beneath the column that concerned him, the scandal, suggested that the piece had been supplied by a correspondent close to the matter. "Do you know this editor?" Moreau asked. The clerk shrugged. "We trade minor items, local curiosities, train mishaps, harvests, that sort of thing. Sometimes they borrow from us, sometimes we print a paragraph or two from them, nothing serious." "Has this scandal reached your pages?" Moreau asked, his gaze lifting. "Not under that name," the clerk replied. "We hear rumors. Misappropriated funds, an investigation quietly redirected. But for something to deserve space in a Paris daily, it needs more than initials and insinuations. It needs names." "And what happens when those names belong to men whose advertisements pay for your ink?" Moreau asked, his tone mild. The clerk's eyes hardened just for a moment. "Inspector, I work with letters and deadlines. The people who decide which scandals live and which die sit in better chairs than mine. If you want to know why something isn't written, you'll have to ask them." A door opened at the far end of the room, and a man with thinning hair and a waistcoat that strained slightly at the buttons stepped out. His watch chain gleamed against the fabric, and his expression carried the weary superiority of someone accustomed to sorting fact from nonsense, and sometimes confusing the two for convenience. "Is there a difficulty?" he asked, taking in the scene with a single practiced glance. Moreau turned slightly. "Only a curiosity," he answered. He nudged the scrap of the provincial paper with a finger. "I'm wondering why this story, which seems to concern a financial scandal and a possible disappearance, did not reach wider attention." The editor picked up the scrap, skimmed the column, then made a small dismissive sound. "Provincial dramatics," he said. "Small-town politics, a few missing francs, and a clerk with a guilty conscience. Besides, the correspondent who sent this has a tendency to see conspiracies in every unbalanced ledger." "Conspiracies are sometimes what remain when facts don't fit," Moreau replied. "Tell me, did anyone from Chartres write to you urging that the matter be downplayed?" The editor's eyes flicked up, sharp now. "Inspector, you must understand how these things work. We receive letters every day. Some ask us to bury stories, others beg us to spread them. We cannot indulge every request, nor can we ignore those that come from respectable sources. Respectable, Moreau repeated, meaning well-connected. The editor did not confirm, but he did not deny it either. If there was pressure, he said at last, choosing his words with care, it would not be unusual. Men with reputations to protect prefer dust to glare. And what about women who disappear? Moreau asked quietly. Do they prefer dust as well? The question hung there, heavier than the ink-soaked pages. The editor's face tightened. Is there such a woman in this case? There might be, Moreau answered, and a boy who ran far enough that his footsteps ended beneath my window. The editor exhaled slowly, setting the scrap back down as though it now carried a stain. Then you should speak with the smaller papers, he said, the ones that live from whispers. They print what we cannot, or will not. He scribbled 2 names on a piece of paper and slid it toward Moreau. Titles of dailies and weeklies that hovered at the edges of respectability, surviving on rumor and scandal, half their content bought, the other half improvised. Moreau left the office with those names and the weight of a decision pressing on him. The press, he knew, was like a mirror placed at an angle. It showed the world, but only from certain sides. The absence of Etienne's story in its columns did not surprise him. Children from garrets and women who vanished between one platform and the next rarely found their way into printed lines unless their bodies were discovered in a river or an alley. He moved through the streets toward the quarter where the smaller papers kept their cramped offices. The smell here was different, less polished, more urgent. Posters screamed from the walls, ink still fresh, promising revelations about ministers, actresses, and crimes that might never have occurred. Inside one such office, a man with ink on his cuffs and a cigarette dangling from his lips looked up as Moreau entered. "You're early for scandal, Inspector," he said, glancing at the badge. "We usually print it before you arrive." "I'm not here to shut you down," Moreau replied. "On the contrary, I'm here because you print what others swallow." The man's curiosity sharpened. "Then sit," he said, gesturing to a chair missing a piece from its back. "Tell me what Paris has decided not to know." Moreau laid the provincial scrap on the table once again. The editor, younger than the first, eyes bright with a hunger that had nothing to do with food, read it carefully, then whistled. "We received something like this," he said, "but ours was uglier. Mentioned a name outright once before it was scratched out. The rest arrived with certain alterations." "From whom?" Moreau asked. "An anonymous envelope," the man replied. Postmark smudged, but the handwriting spoke of education. Someone who cared about penmanship, and about which names survived the journey. "Do you still have it?" Moreau asked. The editor reached into a drawer and produced a bundle of clippings. From it, he pulled a small piece of paper, the edges uneven. On it, a name had indeed been written, then scratched out so violently that only fragments of letters remained. But fragments were sometimes enough. Certain curves and slashes were unmistakable when one had seen them on a pristine calling card. "It looks like someone changed their mind," the editor remarked, or was persuaded to. "Why didn't you print it as it was?" Moreau asked, though he could guess the answer. The editor gave a short laugh. "I may be bolder than your respectable friends up the hill, Inspector, but I am not suicidal. When men of a certain rank are involved, even rumor costs money, sometimes lives. We tread lightly." "And yet," Moreau said, "you kept the scrap." "I keep everything," the man replied. "One never knows which ghost will come back looking for its reflection." Moreau slipped the scrap carefully into his pocket with the others. The chorus of paper grew louder, the voices aligning. A name written once in full, perhaps, before someone's fear or prudence slashed it out. A name that now floated between rumors, initials, and cautious columns in provincial sheets. A name that had brushed the life of a woman who vanished at a station and a boy who listened at night. When he stepped back outside, Midday had begun to assert itself. The sky hung low and colorless, the air heavy with the threat of rain. Paris moved around him, vendors shouting, carts rattling, a tram grinding past with the weary clang of its bell. On a corner, a man sold newspapers, his voice calling out the day's more palatable scandals. None of them bore the name that mattered. Moreau bought one anyway. As he walked, he imagined what it would be like if Etienne's story were written there in harsh black lines. Unknown woman disappears from Chartres station. Boy brought to Paris under mysterious circumstances. Questions raised about financial misconduct tied to influential figure. He could see the headlines in his mind, yet knew they would not appear. Not while certain hands still controlled which. Truths deserved ink. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridor felt narrower than it had that morning. Janvier met him halfway, face lined with tension. "How was Chartres?" he asked. "Cold," Moreau replied, "and honest enough to be afraid." "And the boy?" he added, before Janvier could answer his own unspoken question. "Asleep when I checked an hour ago," Janvier said. "Your wife sent word. She said he sleeps as if he expects footsteps on the stairs, even where there are none." Moreau nodded, the image cutting deep. "Then we must ensure that when those footsteps finally arrive, they belong to us, and not to whoever believes the boy's silence is still possible." He moved past Janvier and into his office. He laid the scraps of paper, the telegram, the calling card, and the clippings from the smaller paper side by side on his desk. Together, they formed not yet a full picture, but an outline, enough to see the shape of the man who had tried to stand outside the frame. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, tapping softly against the window pane like fingers asking for entry. Moreau listened to it for a long moment, then reached for his pen. There were some stories that would never make it into the newspapers, but they would live in his report, and in the frightened eyes of a boy who knew too much. The rain deepened as evening approached, washing the city in streaks of silver and shadow. From the window of his office, Moreau watched the blurred reflections glide across the wet cobblestones, each passing carriage leaving behind a fleeting shape that dissolved almost at once. Paris had a way of swallowing its own movements, as if the city erased traces deliberately, ensuring that those who wished to hide could do so with little effort. Tonight, that knowledge pressed on him with new weight. The circle around Etienne was tightening, not only around the boy, but around anyone who dared approach the truth he carried in silence. Moreau glanced at the papers arranged on his desk. The calling card, the torn newspaper scrap, the scratched-out name from the scandal sheet. They seemed to form a constellation whose stars had been scattered on purpose. The man who linked them sat far above ordinary men in the social hierarchy, far enough that his influence seeped into the walls of commissariats and the columns of newspapers alike. Moreau had seen such men before. Polished shoes, measured smiles, an air of certainty born from knowing that consequences rarely climbed high enough to reach them. But this time, one of them had crossed into territory where the fragile lives of a woman and a boy had become collateral. Moreau's jaw tightened as he stared at the neat stack of evidence. The circle would tighten, but not only around him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Janvier entered, shaking droplets from his coat. "Lucas wants to speak with you," he said. "Something about the sketches." Moreau nodded. They walked together to Lucas's small office. The walls were lined with maps and posters, each bearing notes in Lucas's neat hand. The detective sat hunched over his desk, studying two rough charcoal sketches. One portrayed a tall man with prominent cheekbones and a severe brow. The other depicted a shorter figure with close-cropped hair and a narrow mouth that suggested impatience. "These match the descriptions from the café," Lucas said, looking up. Patrons recognized them immediately. They stood out because they never laughed, never loosened up, even after wine. Moreau examined the sketches carefully, and the well-dressed man. No one saw his face clearly, Lucas replied. The proprietor says he carried himself like he expected everyone to make room for him, the kind of man who could stand quietly and still dominate the conversation. Moreau felt that description settle in his bones. It fit the shape of the shadow he'd been tracing since Chartres. A man who never needed to raise his voice. A man whose influence traveled silently, like a river running beneath the floorboards of Paris. "Lucas," Moreau said, lowering his voice, "keep the sketches discreet. Only those we trust should see them." Lucas nodded with understanding. "Moreau, I've worked with you long enough to know when you have a ghost in your pocket. Whoever these men follow, it's someone with reach." "Yes," Moreau said simply. "It is." They stepped into the hallway, the lights humming faintly overhead. Janvier caught up, handing Moreau a small envelope. "This was delivered for you," he said. "No return address." Moreau opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper, a printed sentence, nothing more, clipped from a newspaper and pasted onto the page. "Children repeat what they hear." No signature, no explanation, just that. Janvier swore softly. "Is that a threat?" "A warning," Moreau murmured. "Likely meant to appear subtle. It fails." But the effect was undeniable. Someone knew the boy was with him. Someone who thought subtle intimidation might persuade Moreau to remove himself from the path. He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket, right beside the rest of the evidence. If they believed this would slow him, they did not understand the kind of resolve formed through years of navigating Paris's darkest corners. "Janvier," he said, "I must check on Etienne. Stay close to Lucas, and keep watch for anyone who seems too interested in our movements." He left the Quai des Orfèvres at once, stepping into the rain. The city glowed under the street lamps, each one forming a trembling pool of light on the pavement. As he strode toward his apartment, Moreau's senses sharpened. Habit, instinct, duty. He moved not like a man walking home, but like one entering contested ground. When he reached the building, the stairwell was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of damp. Plaster. He climbed quickly, his boots striking each step with controlled force. At his apartment door he paused, listening, breathing in, attuned to the faintest disturbance. Nothing. He unlocked the door. Madame Moreau looked up from the sofa, where she sat sewing. Her expression eased as she saw him, though a thread of concern remained. "He woke once," she said softly. "A nightmare. But he went back to sleep quickly." Moreau nodded and stepped toward the spare room. He opened the door gently. The boy lay curled beneath the blanket, his face turned toward the wall, breath slow and even. For a moment, Moreau allowed himself the luxury of stillness. The boy's presence, small and fragile within the quiet room, made the case feel painfully human. Not a file, not a puzzle, a life waiting for answers. He closed the door and joined his wife in the sitting room. "There's danger," she whispered. "There always is," Moreau replied, "but this time it's close." She set her sewing down. "And the boy? He is at the center of something he cannot name. Men with influence want him silent." Madame Moreau's eyes hardened. "Then they will learn he is not alone." He felt a surge of gratitude. Quiet, but powerful. It steadied him as he turned back toward the door. "I must go out again," he said. His wife nodded. She understood without needing details. The rain had eased when he stepped outside again. Paris glistened under the returning calm, as though washing away evidence of secrets. But Moreau walked with new purpose. He made his way to the address scribbled by the second newspaper editor, the one who had shown him the scratched-out name. It led him to a narrow alley off Rue des Petites Écuries, where a door without a sign opened into a smoky attic office lit by a single bulb. Inside, an older man sat at a typewriter, cigarette smoke curling above him. I don't print what you want, he said without looking up. I'm not here for printing, Moreau replied. I want the letters you received, the ones asking you to bury the scandal. The man paused mid-keystroke. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of choices past finally settled. He opened a drawer and withdrew a stack of letters tied together with twine. You're the first to ask, he said, and the only one who looks like he should have. Moreau untied the bundle. The handwriting varied, but the tone did not. Polite but firm, urgent but restrained. And among them, one with a signature he recognized instantly, because he had seen the same angular flourish on the calling card from the café. A man whose business dealings in Chartres had been quietly erased. A man who had met with the two strangers. A man who had touched the life of a woman who vanished. A man wealthy enough to persuade, distant enough to avoid blame, cautious enough to whisper through others rather than speak. Moreau felt something cold coil inside him. The circle had tightened indeed. Around him. Around Etienne. Around a truth that someone tried too hard to bury. He slipped the letters back into the envelope and looked at the editor. Did anyone else come for these? He asked. No, the man replied. Just you. Then keep them hidden, Moreau said, for your safety and for the truth. When Moreau stepped back into the street, the rain had stopped entirely. The city held its breath. Lamps gleamed on puddles that reflected the clouds drifting overhead. He began to walk. Toward the quay. Toward answers. Toward confrontation. The circle had tightened. Now it was time to see who stood at its center and how far they would go to keep a boy silent. Paris did not wake gently the next morning. A low mist rolled in from the Seine, settling along the bridges and curling through the narrow streets like a creature seeking shelter. It blurred the lamps, softened the outlines of buildings, and reduced every footstep to a muffled echo. To Moreau, the fog felt less like weather and more like a warning, the city's way of reminding him that truth, once uncovered, could be as treacherous as the shadows that concealed it. He walked toward the Quai des Orfèvres, with a sense of inevitability thick in his chest. The stack of letters retrieved from the attic office lay inside his coat, their weight disproportionate to the paper they were written on. Some bore polite threats, others offered veiled reassurances. All of them circled the same name, a man whose influence stretched from provincial town halls to the polished floors of Parisian ministries. A man who hid behind initials in newspapers, behind emissaries in cafes, behind strangers in garrets. A man who had, knowingly or not, brushed the life of a woman who had vanished at a provincial station and left her son to outrun danger in the fog of Rue du Cherche-Midi. As Moreau crossed the final bridge, the mist swallowed the arches behind him. He felt the city closing ranks, as though it understood what he carried. In other times, he might have described the sensation as paranoia. This morning, it felt like clarity. Inside the quay, officers moved with the familiar morning urgency, retrieving files, delivering reports, lighting cigarettes with fingers still cold from the air outside. Yet something in their movements seemed heavier, as if the fog had seeped through the walls and settled inside them. Moreau's presence drew nods, but also glances that carried unspoken questions. There were always rumors in a place like this, some born of truth, others of imagination. Today, the line between the two felt more delicate than ever. He climbed the stairs to Janvier's office, his boots leaving faint damp marks on the stone. Janvier stood near the window, hands in his pockets, staring at the river below. When he turned, worry clouded his features. "You heard," he said quietly. "Heard what?" Moreau asked, though a knot already tightened in his stomach. "Someone was here this morning asking questions, not directly about the boy, not foolish enough for that, but about you. About the case you've been pursuing too energetically." Their words. Moreau let the information settle, though it merely confirmed what he already sensed. Did they leave a name? No, Janvier replied, but they had the tone of someone who expected answers and obedience. Moreau's jaw tightened. Where is Etienne? At your home, Janvier said. Madame Moreau sent word. He ate breakfast but spoke little. She thought he sensed something. Children sense more than we give them credit for, Moreau murmured. Especially children who've lived among whispers. He handed Janvier the bundle of letters. Janvier untied the twine, scanning the pages with mounting disbelief. This is enough to start a storm in any ministry. Only if made public, Moreau said. And those who signed these letters know it. You think they'll act against you? Janvier asked. I think, Moreau answered. They already have. Before Janvier could respond, Lucas appeared in the doorway, breath quickening. There's someone waiting downstairs for you, he said. A messenger. He wouldn't give his name. Did he say why he came? Lucas swallowed. He carries a note, and his expression is that of a man who wants to leave quickly. Moreau descended the staircase, each step echoing in the silent corridor. At the bottom stood a man in a dark coat, hat pulled low, hands clasped together as though containing a tremor. When he saw Moreau approach, he extended a sealed envelope. For you, Inspector, he said. His voice, though steady, carried the timbre of someone delivering a message on behalf of someone far more powerful. I was told to give this to you and leave at once. I know nothing of its contents. Moreau took the envelope, noticing its quality. Thick stationery, embossed with a crest that could only belong to someone who moved within certain circles. He slipped it open. The handwriting inside was elegant, practiced, meant to convey calm authority. Inspector Moreau, there are matters that should not concern you. Your attention to them is unnecessary and unwise. For your own good, and for the good of those around you, we ask that you refrain from further inquiry. Your cooperation in this will be remembered. No signature, only a single initial, the same initial that appeared on the calling card. When he folded the letter, something steadied inside him, as if the warning had crystallized rather than shaken his resolve. He looked up at the messenger. Did the person who sent you give instructions if I refuse? The man hesitated. Only that the inspector would understand the consequences. Moreau nodded once. Tell him I understand. The messenger fled as though spirit chased. Returning to his office, Moreau found Janvier and Lucas waiting. He tossed the letter onto the desk. Lucas exhaled softly. They're closing in. Yes, Moreau said, which means we are close to the truth. And the mother? Janvier asked. What do you believe happened? Moreau leaned against the desk, the room suddenly feeling too small, the walls too close. She knew something. Not the full scope, perhaps, but enough to be considered a liability. She fled, or tried to, and someone intercepted her. Do you think she's alive? Lucas asked. Moreau paused. I think, he said quietly, that someone wanted her silence. Whether she remains alive depends on whether she gave them reason to believe she would speak. The rain began again, tapping the window pane softly, as if urging him to continue. But the boy, Moreau said, was unexpected. They thought him harmless, invisible, a child who would not understand the conversations drifting down through old floorboards. And yet, Janvier murmured, he understood enough. Yes, Moreau's voice hardened. Enough to be dangerous, enough to be hunted. Lucas stepped forward. What will you do now? What indeed? Moreau felt the answer settle like a stone in deep water. I'll meet the man behind the letters, he said. Not in courts or offices, but here, in the city he thinks he owns. Janvier's brow furrowed. You intend to confront him? I intend, Moreau said, to give him the opportunity to tell me what he should have told the world and I will decide afterward which truths belong in the report. And if he refuses? Moreau looked at the calling card on his desk. Then he will be the one standing in the fog. That evening, Paris felt unnaturally quiet. The fog thickened as Moreau walked through Rue du Grenier Saint-Lazare, the lamps glowing with dim halos that barely pierced the mist. He reached a small square lined with private offices and discreet apartments. The man he sought waited near a wrought-iron gate, hands clasped behind him, posture relaxed, too relaxed, the kind of calm worn by men who believed nothing could touch them. "Inspector," he said, voice smooth as polished marble. "You've been busy." Moreau stopped a few paces away. "And you've been careless." A faint smile touched the man's mouth. "If you had stayed where you belonged, none of this would have concerned you." "A woman disappeared," Moreau said. "A boy nearly followed. That concerns me." "They were never the focus," the man replied. "Collateral at most." Moreau felt a spark of anger flare in his chest. "Children are not collateral." The man tilted his head. "You care more than is wise. This is a matter of governance, Inspector. Of influence, not of your garrets or your tenements." "And yet," Moreau said, stepping closer, "your men fled those garrets in the night. A woman outran you, a boy outwitted you." The faint smile vanished. "What do you want?" the man asked. "Truth," Moreau said. "Not confession, not apology. Truth." The man's gaze darkened. "Truth is curated, Inspector, as are the men who survive it." Moreau breathed in the cold air, the fog settling on his coat like ash. "Then give me a curated version." The man studied him, weighed him, judged how far intimidation might work. "It was never meant to reach Paris," he said at last. "The misappropriation was meant to be contained. A ledger corrected, a clerk dismissed quietly. But she dug. She asked questions she had no right to. She took the boy to Chartres. Perhaps she believed someone there would protect her, but fear made her clumsy." "What happened to her?" Moreau asked softly. The man's gaze did not flinch. "She was persuaded to stop asking questions." "And the boy?" "A complication," he said, "but complications can be removed." Moreau stepped forward, the fog swirling around him. "The boy is under my protection, and your reach ends here." For the first time, the man seemed uncertain. "You are alone, Inspector." "No," Moreau said. "Paris watches when it chooses to." A light flickered in a nearby window. Footsteps sounded in the fog. Janvier's, Lucas's, others. The man stiffened. Moreau lowered his voice. "This is the moment you realize you misjudged the value of a child." The man turned as if calculating escape. But the fog, faithful for once, closed around him like a curtain. By the time Moreau and his men stepped forward, he had vanished into the mist. But this time, Moreau felt no defeat. Some truths did not need arrests. Some truths did not need headlines. Some truths needed only to be written, carefully, quietly, by a man who understood which silences were worth protecting. When Moreau returned home, the fog followed him to his doorstep like an escort. Inside, Etienne sat at the table, a cup of warm milk between his hands. He looked up as Moreau entered, eyes searching his face. "Is it over?" the boy whispered. Moreau nodded, hanging his coat. "For you, yes." The boy's shoulders eased. "And my mother?" Moreau paused, then knelt beside him. "I do not know where she is, but I know someone feared her strength. That means she was brave." Etienne blinked hard. "Will she come back?" "I don't know," Moreau said honestly. "But I will look for her. That is a promise." The boy nodded slowly, accepting the only truth the world could offer him now. Later, as Etienne slept and Madame Moreau extinguished the lamps, Moreau stood by the window, watching the fog drift across the street. It no longer felt threatening. It felt like a veil, protecting, softening, concealing. He knew the truth now, not the whole truth, but enough. Enough to write what mattered, enough to protect the boy, enough to leave the rest in silence where Paris hid its deepest wounds. The fog lifted slightly at dawn, revealing only the quiet streets of a city returning to normal. But Moreau knew better. Some stories never ended. They simply learned to live inside the mist,